Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. Hosted by the editors of Writer's Digest, this monthly podcast features conversations with writing and publishing experts whose insights will help ignite your creative vision, hone your skills, build your platform, and get your work out into the world.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Writer's Digest Presents. I'm content editor Michael Woodson, alongside editor-in-chief Amy Jones. Today, we're discussing a topic that is an important element for every author, regardless of their publishing journey. Whether they're interested in traditional publishing, self-publishing, or hybrid publishing, every author needs to carefully consider the design of their book. Because though we try to deny it, the vast majority of us do judge books by their covers. A great book cover could lead us to a genre we maybe wouldn't have picked before, and a bad one could keep us away from a book that could have been the greatest book we ever read. To join us in this conversation, we're chatting with Zachary Petit and Charlotte Strick. Thank you so much for joining us, both of you. If you don't mind briefly telling the listeners about yourselves, Zach, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us, Michael. My name is Zach Petit, and I am a contributing writer at Fast Company, where I cover design. And I used to be on staff at Writer's Digest as managing editor. And then I moved to Print Magazine, which is a design magazine, where I started sort of carving out a niche and writing about book covers, which sort of combined my nerdy love of design and literature. And that's also where I first encountered Charlotte Strick. And I have a book coming out in the fall from Bloomsbury's 33 1/3 series called The Moon in Antarctica. And I'm very nerdily excited about it, and turn it over to Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Michael and Amy, for having me today, and for Zach for extending the invitation to join you all. I am thrilled to be here and very glad for Zach's nerdiness so that we could find one another. I started my book career after a short and colorful stint in the fashion world. I started my book career at Farrar, Straus & Giroux, and moved my way up the ranks in my 14 years there to art director of the Faber and Faber US imprint and FSG's paperback line. And during my time there, I also took on the role as art editor and designer of the Paris Review under two different editors. And in 2014, I left FSG and started my own small boutique, women-led graphic design firm focused on mission-driven organizations and, of course, book publishing. My business partner, Claire Williams-Martinez, and I both started after we met at Parsons School of Design and in our mid-20s, and vowed we would have a studio one day. So we ran it for 10 years, and we did all sorts of cool things aside from book covers, which was great because, it's hard to only work in a vertical rectangle.
Sure.
But it was a first love, and we appreciate all the amazing jobs that came with that. Last year, while Claire was back in school getting a master's in social work, adding to her impressive resume, I took on a new client, Bindery Books, and they're based in San Francisco, and a very original way of publishing books. It was founded by an old coworker of mine at FSG, Matt Kay, and his business partner, Meg Harvey. I hope I get to tell you a little bit about it today.
Yeah.
But I just officially became their creative director last month. So,
wonderful.
Yeah.
So first I'll just ask, Zach, you mentioned your nerdiness. Charlotte, you mentioned fashion as sort of like your bridge to book design and book covers. But so that makes me wonder, what is your relationship with book design and cover design, and how has that evolved over time?
Yeah, I guess for me, I've always been the type of person who buys a wine based on the label, and so I feel like book covers are sort of the same way, where a really good book cover can really draw you in. And I've discovered actually a lot of great authors that way. I mean, I think that's how I first came across Tom Robbins and people like that when I was in high school. It has led, I feel like, to it's been less successful when it comes to finding wines, but for books, I feel like it's it really, and it's crazy too, because I feel like a good book cover to me is one that you could sort of pull off and put on your wall and frame, and it's just endlessly more fascinating because of the entire story world that it brands.
For me, it's kind of from birth. My dad was a book publisher, and my mom was in fashion. So I often joke about how I followed my mom as long as I possibly could. She warned me. But my skin's a little thin for the garment industry. But I did have some amazing experiences there, which of course, all
Yeah,
inform how I solve creative problems today too. Even the bad ones, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But
sure.
um, I had always admired book covers because they were just part of, the family tapestry. And my father was instrumental in the investing of uh, an effort to bring trade books to the US in the way that we think of them today. So prior to the kind of hardcover size paperbacks that we're all used to seeing in the bookstore and buying, the US market paperbacks were really only dime store romances, body romances and mysteries. And those are, of course, wonderful too. My dad was introduced to a gentleman who was interested in financing that for the U.S. market. And my dad, who had always wanted to be a book publisher, thought it was incredibly romantic and for the son of immigrant kids in Brooklyn without a whole lot of access to that kind of upper crust space, which we are all trying to hammer at today. He had the greatest respect for words always and language. And this gave him an entree. And then later he was aware of a publishing company where the founder was retiring, and he took it over, called Taplinger Press. And he continued to run it till he refused to sell it, even into his late 80s, much to my mother's
Wow.
chagrin. So he just, it had a backlist, still sold a tiny bit, but that was really important to him. So books and book design and the artifact that is book jacket design was just always, I don't know, it's just a part of the fabric of my growing up.
That's interesting. It's interesting, Zach, you say, a great book cover is one that you want to frame. And your background, Charlotte, in fashion, like immediately two book covers come to mind that I've loved in the last couple of years, which are Hilary Leichter's book Temporary, I think has such a gorgeous cover. If you haven't, Google it later. And then the French Dispatch cover, I can't remember who wrote that, but that has a very like fashion, what am I trying to say? Like sketchy, like
more
vibe to the cover that I just love.
More of a
and it's true. Like a really good cover really does make me want to. I reached out to the artist of Hilary Leichter's and was like, "Are you selling this? Like, I would love to frame it." And she was like, "Nope, I'm not."
Oh no.
I know, but
That's all right.
I find that different genres seem to have different expectations about what makes a quote unquote good book cover. I feel like contemporary and literary fiction in particular go through a lot of different trends. And whereas something like science fiction or fantasy, while certainly the cover designs do evolve over time, there's a certain uniformity to the general vibe, I'll say, of those covers throughout like publishing history. So my question for both of you, and Charlotte, I guess we can start with you, is do you think design trends move in different directions with regards to genre?
Yeah, I think that they do. I kind of, with my own work, like possibly because of my interest in design from an early age, not just in books, but specifically in fashion and fabric and patterns and color. As you can probably see behind me, I still like to surround myself with it. I I take note of trends, and living in New York, I'm able to do that like up close and personal with people in the subway, which is very cool, not just with clothes and just the way people talk and move, but also what books they're reading, if they're reading physical books at all. But it's true that I do see them. Um, and so I'm aware of those trends, but I
Mm-hmm.
kind of absorb them in a way that it's more like almost a subconscious way, because I think I don't want my work to ever look outdated. And so, if I'm given an assignment that's a genre assignment, I feel like I kind of am able to pull out the file cabinet in my brain and be like, okay, what have I seen recently or in the last, 5 years in this space? And of course, publishers do provide you with that information too. They'll often call out titles that have sold really well, obviously, and say,
Mm-hmm.
we love how this looked, which translates to we love how this did, but a little bit of both, and for obvious
Yeah.
reasons. And so I do think that obviously there are trends in typography. And there are trends in materials too. Sometimes printers will come out with a new material for us all to use that's affordable, because trade books often don't have, the price points to be able to throw the kitchen sink as far as production at them, the way art books are. So then everybody, will start using a certain kind of lamination over on their jackets, and that will shift like the possibilities for getting a rich black, or, a lot of people ask me if I know what it's called when a book feels really, really soft, because the jacket will have this kind of almost spongy quality.
Mm-hmm.
It's called soft touch. So there you go. Mystery
Yeah.
solved. But that's kind of like I love it, I hate it, But anyway, those things do affect the way color is printed. And it's very subtle, but those do shift the way that we might approach something. So it's always, you're only as good as your printer, just like with web design, you're only as good as your developer. So we like to, I think a lot of designers in all fields think about, how it's going to be produced, how it's going to be seen, not just online, which of course is how most people experience even book jackets today, but also how it will feel when it's in your hands. We were talking about dime store novels earlier, and obviously that had a very specific look that is considered incredibly retro now. And there are some moments where we get to reach into those toolkits and say, oh, we want this to look really Art Deco, or we want this to look like a 1920s crime story. But I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes publishers have a reaction against that, where they'll feel that while the designer feels like, oh, this is the perfect visual language for something, the publisher and marketing departments and publicity departments might feel otherwise. They might see it as, oh, this is going to translate as dusty and an older book rather than something on the front list. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it too. But I do think that the way that other forms of art shift and change affect how we all what we expect from design. I'm always shocked when I look at a TV show from the 90s that, of course, I thought looked good at the time. I didn't think anything of it. And I look at it now, I'm like, oh my God, did we really watch this? It's so out of focus.
Yeah.
So, those kinds of, those sort of things do like trickle down into books as well. So I don't know if I answered your question
yeah, for sure.
Opened up lots of new.
And you brought up a really good point. Charlotte, too, about the role that marketing departments play. Because I feel like it is a significant one in terms of, like genre expectations. And I think the bigger the publisher, the more that factors in. And so I think to me, the really interesting covers are the ones that sort of manage to sneak their way through and break out. And you're like, what is this? It just looks so completely different and so interesting. And what's funny is then that type of book could be one that sets a future trend that then the marketing department people are like, oh, everything should look like this.
Definitely.
But yeah,
that's right.
And I think for me, for me, literary fiction tends to be the most interesting, and so does poetry. And I think because it's so abstract, and there's less of like a narrative, or less of like all poetry books must look like this. That's where you get some really unexpected, really weird, really interesting covers.
Yeah. And I think, Zach, the reason probably for that, to be honest, is also like the expectation for sales on a poetry book are not the same as
Yeah,
a book of fiction.
exactly.
So, you can kind of fly
Exactly.
under the radar a little bit. So yeah, there's a little bit of that. When I worked at Faber too, we used to be able to be inventive with play covers as well, which would be different than the poster art oftentimes.
Right. Have you worked with New Directions before, Charlotte?
I never have had the great fortune, but I've certainly worked with Rodrigo on lots of projects, but never for New Directions. But they do honor the artful cover.
Yeah, I feel like their covers they're always so interesting and so just sort of out of the box and so unique that to me
Yes,
is sort of what I go to them for when looking for.
definitely, definitely. Actually, a colleague of mine who owns Hat and Beard Press. Are you guys aware of them in California?
Yeah.
They they I don't know what's happening with that book, but they were working on a compendium of New Directions covers,
Oh
and I
man.
don't know, it's been in the works for a long time, but I was very excited for it for that very reason.
I'm curious, Amy and Michael, from your perspective, where do you guys feel like you're seeing the most interesting covers?
I have, well, going the New Directions, I have impulse buyed many of those books that I didn't know existed. I just happened to be in an indie bookstore and happened upon them, and the covers of those books really caught my eye, and I have impulse purchased them. Charlotte, you mentioned the soft touch covers. I think I have impulse purchased many of those.
Just so
Impulse
you could
bought
go
many of
home
those.
and pet it.
Oh yeah, yep.
That's funny.
But sure, I think the literary covers that do something interesting with a piece of artwork, that somehow you don't know how it fits into the story of the
Right.
book until you read it, and then it kind of makes sense. Those are the ones that I'm drawn to. And then on the other side of that, the mystery thrillers or the romance covers that sort of have a similar font or a similar feel, I'll get drawn in by those. But then I see so many of them that are similar because they're all trying to do a similar thing, draw people in. Then I can't remember which ones I've read, and I have to go back and look through my stacks of books or look through my Goodreads to remind myself which of these have I picked up
Wow.
before,
Yeah.
and which of them are new. So I think that's my struggle with some of the genre
Same.
fiction that feels similar.
Yeah. And I'm with you there, Amy. I am also like very drawn to literary fiction novels, and it's of course like it's because I'm drawn to literary fiction as well. It is like my genre of choice, and I think it's because over time, I think literary fiction has proven to be like just such an exciting genre to play in general, because it is not beholden to any rules. And so every story I read that is literary or contemporary is so different from the last literary or contemporary work that I read. And the covers reflect that, in my opinion. Like there's just so much diversity within the genre. But then I do feel, I mean, I there was a book that it was a huge fantasy book that I just completely ignored because I just thought the cover was really terrible. And my friend, who I just adore and has like I trust her opinion so much. She was like, "You would love this book," and I was like, "Are you sure?" And it's one of the best books I've read in the last decade, and I would have never picked it up.
Wow.
And it did and then because of that experience reading it, I got closer to the cover. Like I started to love the cover for it being not great,
Oh, I love
and so
that.
but like at face value, at like if we're judging books by their covers, I am incredibly drawn to literary covers, because I do think it is often doing something that is meaningful to the story that I'm about to read, that is not overtly about the story I'm about to read. And I find that really compelling.
the fact that we're having this conversation really just shows how absolutely critical book covers are to, to any project. And I think, like, especially when it comes to self-published books, independently published books. I remember judging the self-published awards for Writer's Digest back in the day. I mean, it just, having a great book cover really adds such an amazing degree of just of authority and authenticity over a project too, that really is critical.
We still consider that, when we are judging the self-published book awards, does this book cover look professional? Does it, connect to the topic in a clear way?
Mm-hmm.
We still consider that.
I mean, I'm sort of aware of the self-published book award, jacket awards, but I hadn't really stopped to think about. I mean, I do get requests sometimes from people who are self-publishing, and I would say more and more, just because it's become easier thanks to various platforms to do so.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just thinking of what an array that must be of of design, because of course, just like everybody's a writer, everybody's a designer. So there's must be some pretty good. I'm imagining what categories you might have, but maybe they're just and I don't mean to make fun. It's just interesting. It reminds me, there have been times in my career, even working on staff, where you present a cover and you hand it over to the editor. They act as liaison between you and the author. That's the typical relationship. Sometimes you end up speaking to the authors directly, but that's how it has been for a long time. And sometimes, they don't want to show you what the author has said about your work. But it could be, obviously useful to getting to a final product. And I remember someone once gave me, back when more people put pen to paper, gave me like a 6-page letter about how much they disliked my cover and how they showed it to their aunt. Surely, I can't remember.
Oh, wow.
And she also hated it. I have it
good.
somewhere. I saved it because
Yeah.
it was extreme, and it's somebody else's baby before it's yours as a designer, and that's really important to remember. And if it's useful, if it's not just I hate this, I hate that, if you're able to extract from that, like, what it is that they don't want and what they haven't seen yet, then you might actually come up with something great. And I have had authors like do little doodles, like, I really like this over here, but and so I imagine in the self-publishing world, where people don't know how to find a book cover designer, and they try it on their own, or they have a friend who's an artist who makes something, that must be an interesting selection. And I'm sure there's some gems in there too.
Author input is something I did want to talk about because, before I worked for Writer's Digest, I worked for Northlight Books as an editor, and I was that liaison between the authors, who were artists, and the designers, who were also artists in their own right, and working on these book covers, but had very specific considerations to take into account when it came to those kinds of nonfiction instructional books that they were working on. The artist authors always had a vision of what they wanted their book cover to look like, because they are artists and it is their art that is being represented in the book and on the cover. But then they didn't always understand why the designers had to do certain things. Like, I brought props for this because it was fascinating to me when I when I first started there. So, like, the art instructional books were the biggest retailers were Hobby Lobby and Michael's, and they displayed their books in a very specific fashion.
So you were working with fully illustrated books.
Yes.
So
they
the title had to be
in racks like this. Yeah, so the titles had to be in the top third, and it had to be a specific size so that it would fit. So the artwork had to be arranged. We had to choose artwork based on that arrangement. So the main focus had to be lower than what we picked, or with watercolor books, we sold a lot of books into Canada, so we couldn't have artworks that had the American flag, the United States flag on it, because, well, it won't sell as well in Canada because people are going to think it's only Americans, United States scenes. So it was so interesting having those conversations with the authors, and the savvy ones would work into their contracts consultation on the cover.
Smart.
So I wondered, how is that different? I mean, I have no idea what the fiction side of things look like.
Sure.
How do those authors, what kind of input do they have? Do they work it into their contract? It sounds like the editor still is a liaison, but do you work with them?
Well, a couple things. I mean, it really depends on the publisher, how much say they get. And it doesn't actually depend on the size, because just the other day I was talking to a new bindery author who published once before, and I actually didn't look up her press, but I suspect it was a small independent press for her first book, this being her second one that I'm just starting working on. And at the end of my initial mood board presentation for ideas that I had, she just said, "I just want to thank you for including me in this process and giving me so many options, because my last jacket I hated from the moment I saw it." Wow. And I said, "I really don't like this. Whatever you do, don't do this." And that's what got printed. That's not just sad for the author, it's also sad for the designer, because especially now when everybody's online talking about things, if you really dislike something, you don't feel like it represents your book, your writing style, your aesthetic, you're probably going to tell people because, it's like having someone dress you, back to fashion, but like having someone dress you in clothes that don't represent who you are. So, it is a jacket in that way. And so, yeah, a colleague of mine years ago had the most unfortunate experience where, not at FSG, but at another imprint, where the author disliked the cover. And I don't remember what the input was. This was years ago, that he received, but the author went to the extreme where they actually created a sticker that was the size of the book cover to recover all of their covers. That is the most extreme instance of that I've heard.
Sure.
But
wow.
Yeah, that was really shocking and upsetting for the designer too. So, it really, for everybody's sake, it is important to find a place where everyone can be happy. And I don't know why. I've never worked anywhere where the author wasn't included, so I'm not sure what the thinking is beyond I don't know, some bad experience that was had, or timelines. But it really, I don't think it's a good way to operate in any kind of business. You want your customer to be happy. They're going to do more to advertise, and that's ever so important. So, but yes, typically, you take in-house, at FSG, when I was there, we got to make wish lists of titles we wanted to work on based on big launch meetings where we'd have all the editors sit down and tell us about their new titles, and make short lists of the books we hope to work on. Sometimes they were authors we'd collaborated with before, so that made it an obvious pick. And then other times, of course, we all wanted to work on the same thing. So we would do a lot of trading around with the creative director's approval, and that was fun. And when I first started working at FSG, that meant that you left that art department meeting with a stack of manuscripts that were printed out that you could not see over. So that was always very interesting reading on the subway. But then the advent of the Kindle, and I've forgotten what we were given, but some kind of book device
version of that
was
yeah.
very, very it was a dinosaur of its kind. And but it made carrying that stack less painful. But I do remember several people would ask me on the subway, like, what are you reading? What is that? What is that machine? And I would tell them, and then I would say, but don't buy one because I don't want you to buy it. Like, I'm going to be out of a job. Please, you don't want this. But anyway, so I diverge. But the the typical process is that the designer then, reads the manuscript, or if it's, I've worked on books where it's still being translated and I only had, a paragraph that was described in a pitch letter. Sometimes you don't have a whole manuscript. When I worked on Roberto Bolaño's 2666, it was in the middle of translation, so I read it in like pieces that weren't in order. So I read it in even a crazier way than Bolaño envisioned it. So people often say, "Oh, book 3 did it," and I'll say, I don't even know what was book 3 for book 1, but that made it, extra. Well, that was a very special
I did not
project.
know that you designed that book cover until right before this when I got on your website. And I just need to tell you, I impulse purchased that book when I worked at Borders because the cover was so fascinating to me. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you. I mean, FSC, thank you. Did you buy the hardcover or did you buy the slipcase?
I did.
Okay. So
no, I bought
paperback slipcase edition that was limited edition. It was published at the same time. And
okay.
That is a fun underground thing to go hunting for if you have time totally. Or have the desire. It's that was even more amazing, but that's maybe for another podcast. Happy to talk about that. But in those cases, well, that's actually an interesting conversation because, with an author who's no longer alive, who is it who is involved in the approval process? And that's different. You usually have an estate, which means more people. So that can be very unfortunate. And then years ago, I gave a talk, like a roundtable conversation at the Type Directors Club about how book covers get repackaged in different countries, which I knew was going to be very amusing to those who care about such things, and that also plays into it. So here you have a Latin American author who's deceased, and how the American audience perceives the writing versus the Latinx audience and European audience, and so on. It's very different. The look and feel of books are quite different in different countries. And while we are sort of homogeneous these days, some reason book jackets remain still quite individualized from country to country, market to market, which is fascinating. So while we might all be resisting buying, the next cheap pair of pants at H&M, we're still like, nope, this jacket should be in France, it's going to be white, and there's going to be, a single beautiful flower bud. And here in the States, we might like have a giant garden and all the type is like hiding in that garden. So, that is really interesting, the different aesthetic.
Zach, I want to kind of talk about your new book because I had a question about book series and the design of those. And your new book was The Moon and Antarctica. That's part of the 33 1/3 series, is that correct?
Yeah.
So how has that book design come about?
Sure. So again, I'm very bad at self-promotion, or I would have a copy of like any of those books right behind me right now. But the funny thing about those is they also 33 1/3 is a series that Bloomsbury has been publishing for maybe 20 years now. But it basically like each book is about a specific album. And so this one that I did is about Modest Mouse's album, The Moon in Antarctica. And their cover format is very streamlined in terms of like it's just like a little piece. It's the album cover itself is inset at the top, and then really the only variability you have is the color of like the bar next to the 33 and a third logo, and then the bottom color. And so it was funny. They presented me with a few options where it was just like different colors mixed up, and I kind of just suggested, hey, why don't we do like this color here and this color here? And I was also surprised that they sort of had like the democratized, like bringing the author in the process too, because because on a series, like I feel like they could just be like, oh yeah, like this is what it's going to be, this is that, but it's very streamlined, and I think it's because they produce so many books a year that it really kind of like in those situations, it really behooves them to have sort of a streamline. Okay, like album here, colors done, to be able just to sort of keep things going. One thing I was curious about, Charlotte, too, especially when you were at FSG, was how many on average book covers do you create for like the average project? Because I mean, like I've seen designers who have done dozens and dozens and dozens, for a single project, and it's just completely fascinating, especially when you see some of those rejected covers. Some of them are so good.
Seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Also, I want you to answer that, but also like, how do you separate for you? Like, if that is true, if there are so many, like, I'm sure you have a favorite when you do it.
Yeah.
That's Charlotte actually has a good story about that too. For those covers you were telling me about not too long ago.
Oh God, I'm trying to remember which of the many tales.
It was the series the series that broke your heart.
Oh, you mean that the piece that you wrote?
Yeah.
Yet another long tale. That was for Knausgaard, for the My Struggle series that Zach included my process on that one. But yeah, that's sort of almost like a side tale. It's hard to say because the iteration process is really different for different people.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can literally be, 20 pages in an InDesign file where you're changing color or you're, moving the type from the top to the bottom. So I remember when I first started at FSG, one of my peers would produce just seemingly hundreds and hundreds of printouts, and I thought, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to do this. I was pretty fresh from Parsons at that time, and it was really inspiring to see how she moved from one idea to the next. And I would say photography was much more commonly used back then than illustration. And I mean, certainly type-driven covers, but so we would go to the Strand and we would buy 10 photography books and bring them back and scan them, and oh my God, it's a very expensive and heavy process. But I remember she would just look for the best possible image, and that hunt is something I like to do in other areas of my life. So that was really exciting to me as far as the iteration and development of an idea, learning from her. I now know many years later that if you don't have a good idea from the start, don't just go to your computer. It's like, at least for me, the worst thing I can do, because you're literally just moving typer, hoping that something will appear. And it's a complete waste of time for me. And I used to do it just out of greenness, and I now try to think a little more strategically about the way I'm going to solve something. And I try to, when I'm reading, or sometimes I'm listening now to manuscripts to just save time and multitask. Never a great thing, but possible in this area. And I'll be jotting down, I'll pause or pause my reading or pause the recording and jot down salient moments, passages that inspire an idea or a symbol that's mentioned. I'll realize, oh, I've heard this symbol mentioned 10 times by now. Clearly it would be a great way to solve the jacket. So I'll, make a list and I'll write down all the character names and little things about them in case I need to know, if so and so has bright red hair. Because while I might not want a full illustration of them, I might need a strand of hair, and it would be good to remember. So, so all of that kind of like preliminary work, I see more as iteration work than actual design. As I once thought, oh, I have to make a lot of jackets. So now what I do is almost like pre-production work, where I'll kind of gather all of my materials and then think, okay, well, strategically, like if I was going to use that symbol, how would I use it? And I truly get out pencil and paper, and I'm not a great draftswoman, but I can doodle in a way that tells me, is this something I can solve on my own? Is this something I want to bring an illustrator in on? Who do I know who I could collaborate on typography with to make the thing in my head? So I try not to, I think I'm just no longer intimidated into this idea that I need to show 200 designs. First of all, you tend to be overwhelming people who are not visual people, and they don't know what to do. And so sometimes they might even say, I think I need to see something else. And you think, oh my God, I've shown you everything in my head. It's better to kind of step back and parse. And then, like you said, Michael, you have your own, it's a lot like writing, really, and the writing process. And it's, as you said, Michael, I probably have a favorite, right? And or favorites. Someone once told me years ago, who was in advertising, never show the client. I mean, this is an old adage, but like never show a client something you hate, because they will pick it, and it really does.
Oh, that's
happen.
probably true. Yeah.
So, and I've seen it happen, and you think, oh, I've got to show this just because I have to have, this breadth of thinking. But I think a lot of authors, I notice, they feel very insecure about picking what would be right. It's a very intimidating process for all the reasons, that we started this conversation. Like, people do pick a book by its cover, and they lean on you, rightfully so, to know what's going to appeal in a bookshop. And some of them are colorblind. Sometimes that plays into
I'm colorblind,
which is always really interesting. Yeah, it's really quite common. Mm-hmm. I've had multiple clients at this point who are colorblind, and they can sort of tell me that they like something, but they're not, they don't know what I'm talking about in certain spectrums of color. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So I think it's you get to a place where you feel more confident about what a solve will look like. And I just think that happens with doing this thousands of times, which I have at this point, which is always shocking to me. I wish I had like notches on a head, like how many mechanicals I made. But yeah, like anything you work really hard at and you do repeatedly, you get better at it, and you sort of, if you're conscious, you create maybe an unconscious way of solving problems in a way that's more efficient. So I don't know if that answers your question. I certainly have been sad about many covers, but that never made it to print. But I also recognize that sometimes that first jacket meeting where you show something that you love and nobody loves it the way you love it, and you get over it after a few painful days because you have to move on.
It's very like writing in that way. Like,
it
when
is
you
very
get
like
edits,
writing.
you need to give yourself a couple of days before you react to the edits you get, because they're probably very good edits.
They're probably yeah. And even if it seems like no one's understanding what you were trying to say, the points are valid. They're just coming from a different place.
So I have made covers I much prefer in that second, third round because other people's eyes have been on it. So I don't always think that, it stinks for all sorts of reasons, right? That you have to abandon that paragraph or, the theme. But I think, what it does is actually buy the project more time. And when you have a little more time, you can think more deeply about anything. And that usually means you're going to come to a smarter place with the final work.
It's so interesting because it is so much like for what I do, I write articles every day. And I mean, some of them, despite, in terms of how much they're edited, how much they've sort of been meddled with, it's one of those situations where you're like, oh, I hate this. And then you get feedback and people are like, oh, this is great. But there's like that weird internal thing where you're like, if you only knew like the original.
Totally.
So I have one last question. And Michael, I don't know if you'll have more, but my last question is about sort of the practical considerations of cover design versus the aesthetics and things like, at what point do you think about, placement of the author's name compared to placement of the title? Or what does the spine look like and how will that, pop out on the shelf? Or having, a nice little design element on the spine that nobody else will think about, but you really like, compared to having space on the spine for the author's name or the title, that sort of thing. When do those conversations happen with fiction? Because I know I had experience with that with the nonfiction conversations, right. And it was always
like you were
the
just
practicalities come first.
That's really funny. And there's a difference between nonfiction trade versus
right.
versus the kind of like fully illustrated books you were describing earlier, Amy. I would say sometimes we design, well, now that everything is like faster, I think those conversations happen faster. And also with cover reveals online, those are opportunities to maybe show off some of those things you're describing if it's particularly special. So we might build a 3D cover, like a mock-up of the cover, and be like, look at this spine, it's amazing. The colleague who made the hundreds and hundreds of covers when I first started and inspired me in her deep research, she said to me, it was easily the first, couple of months I was at FSG, she said, all books spend most of their lives spine out. So, never forget a spine. And it was a great piece of book jacket design advice. And I often will tell authors or editors that as well, like there's more real estate than just this rectangle. We have the spine, we have the back cover, you even have the flaps. And if you're lucky, you have end papers and or French flaps if it's a paperback, and the reverse side of that cover to print on. So you can tell more of the story or more of this visual representation in other parts. And you want to do that early on. You want to like sell those ideas early, because I was just discussing this with one of the publishers at Bindery. If you're printing overseas and you have this idea for a foil stamp, for instance, it's better to have those conversations early because you can get pricing and then people can agree on budgets. And that can be hard for designers because sometimes, our best ideas come in the final hour and then there's no time left for those kinds of budgetary conversations. So training ourselves to do some of that work early on, especially when you're in the zone with a particular design. And if you've hired an artist to work with you, you want to contract them not just to do the cover, but also, I would love for you to continue this landscape through the back cover. And, if you have painted the type on the front, I would love if you could translate it in a straight line, because it's going to live here in this skinny space as well as the scattered version that's on the front. So those are conversations you definitely want to have the beginning of the process. And because everyone wants to get paid and move on, so you want to you want to get those conversations. You want to have those conversations early if you're able to.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting you said that, because we talk all the time about how like writing is also a business. Like we like to talk like it is an art form and it is fun, but it is also a business. So you're right. Like there is there's an aspect of it where it's like, we need to move on eventually.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's such a personality trait too.
Absolutely.
Like some people are really good at creating those boundaries from beginning to end, and other people just want to tinker and tinker and tinker. And that happens in both.
Yeah, it's an art
in both
thing.
writing and art making. I think there was one other question Amy asked about the consideration for like placement of type. And I think not unlike what you were describing at, say, Michael's, where you have that stair space that you might find in magazine racks, at any bookstore. The only time where I have had to consider that is for really big books that are going to make it into big box stores. So they're going to be shelved in that way. And you might be fortunate enough to have, a book club sticker at the top. Obviously, that needs to go at the top. If you have an amazing blurb by someone, who everybody knows and is already reading, that wants to go at the top. And, as that's a very small space. In those cases, if it's a major author, their name is probably going to go there too. And then when you're thinking about the hierarchy of information on the rectangle, then those things are going to be larger and, take up more real estate. So, but that's a very classic way of dealing with a bestseller. And that has shifted, I think, over time. If you look at like 80s, 90s, we were talking about, big mystery thrillers, like we think of Michael Chabon, we think of like his name at the top before we even get to Jurassic Park. But that's a convention that I think has changed in the way that, and in the same way that illustration, how we perceive illustration in the adult market, very, very different than when I started. That used to signal YA, and that is a whole other conversation too.
I was going to say, that is a huge conversation in the romance community right now.
Yes.
Like,
Completely.
Why are
really?
all the
Like
covers illustrated? They're targeting, they look like they're for younger people.
Yeah.
And
it's fascinating.
It's interesting. I just read a big article about how Harlequin just rebranded, and part of it was their cover strategy. And so it's interesting because they're trying to like dig into like the subgenres of romance. And so like there's like sports romance is a thing I didn't know existed, but like it's interesting seeing them apply like genre conventions to all these different segments instead of just the couple clinch, which is the default. But yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, yes. To put it lightly, it is fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I've got to look up the Harlequin redesign.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then like also just enjoy them a little bit.
Yeah.
And are all those covers, they're like the people, you're seeing the people head to toe, right? Like meeting.
So they're
like
kind of
meet cute on the cover kind of thing.
Yeah, they're kind of changing it up. Like they're throwing in they're throwing in some illustration. They're throwing in less photography and less of just that illustrated. We think of like the Fabio type thing in our minds when we think of romance, and they're really it's interesting. Like there's like thriller romances where it looks like a Lee Child book. Like it's really completely crazy and fascinating.
It's such a huge genre now. Like and maybe it always was, but I think it is informing like the different sex within the genre is being like illustrated in what you're seeing in book covers as well, which kind of leads me a little it leads me a little bit to my last question, because there are so many books now, and there are so many genres, and there are so many genres within genres, and if there are designers or people who are interested in getting into book design, like that could feel, I would imagine, a little bit overwhelming. So what is your general advice for designers who are looking to get into book design and book art?
Zach, do you have any? I'm curious if you have any.
Yeah, so
If you've picked up any.
for me, it just comes down to, I think, just paying, sort of getting your antenna up and really paying attention to what's in the market and sort of, developing sort of an aesthetic for what you think your book could look like or should look like. There's also a website that a book designer named Zoe Norvell runs called I Need a Book Cover. And I think the URL might even just be ineedabookcover.com. But she actually has a great resource because it shows like you can break it down by, I think you could break it down by genre, by color, by designer. And so it could really give you sort of a sense of like, okay, like here's, this, it could give basically writers a way to look and see what they think their book could look like. And it really just started like, it's a great tool for starting to develop sort of that radar.
The flip side of that site is that as a designer, you're welcome to be listed there and you can show your work. So I don't know if you have to apply if you're not already on there. I can't remember how I ended up on there, but I'm grateful to be listed amongst my peers. But so I don't know what the application process is, Michael, for those who might not be already on listed on Flaps but want to be. I always tell people to go to the bookstore, people who would be jacket designers, to go to the bookstore and just, it's a little bit like what Zach was saying about writers, like look for the imprints. Well, look at the jackets that appeal to you. I mean, that's your taste, right? That's what you want to make if you're not making it, or you already see yourself in those designs and think, well, I'm already doing this, but I'm doing it for some other medium. And then start to see if it's the same imprint over and over again that you're choosing, or certain imprints keep coming up. Those are probably the people you want to approach with your portfolio. If you've never, it isn't easy to break in. You probably going to do an internship somewhere and do a lot of grunt Photoshop work and Illustrator. It helps to have those Adobe skills, no doubt. Because, if you're starting from scratch, those are the skills that any creative director is going to want you to have so that you can help them produce books. And then really the best thing you can do is to work as a junior designer at a house who's doing, the kind of books that you love to read and the design that you appreciate, and learn from the other people on staff, and really try to soak up their knowledge. And I think if you haven't gone to design school, it's not a necessity, but I would definitely recommend taking some typography classes online. So many schools are now making their coursework available. You don't have to come live in New York to take a course from someone who knows fonts better than you do at this point. So it's so important, I think, to really good jacket design to be someone who's aware of trends in typography and to really respect letter forms, because it's not just about the art, it's also about the words. And the more you understand typographers, and like, I love discovering new type foundries and all over the world that you can use their trial fonts sometimes, and that just changes everything. If you're a student, sometimes you get a student discount on fonts to build your library. It's just incredibly helpful to becoming the designer of that literary fiction we were talking about. You'll note that anybody doing those really smart lit covers, they understand typography as much as they understand conceptual thinking. And it's the pairing of those two things that makes those covers stick in our heads.
Well, this has been really lovely and informative. Thank you so much, Zach and Charlotte, for joining us today. I think this will be really helpful and interesting for our listeners, regardless of their publishing journeys. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much for having us, Michael.
Thanks for listening to Writer's Digest Presents. We're taking a break in July, but come back and join us in August, where we'll be discussing how social media and book influencers are shaping and informing the publishing industry. Until then, find us online at writersdigest.com or follow us on social media at Writers Digest.